Okay, so I've got a basic scene set up here. You might have a more complicated scene with a more complicated animation. The purpose of this tutorial is just to focus on getting the smoke part of the simulation for the dust coming off the tires correct, or at least to give you a good foundation that you can build on for setting up this kind of dust coming off the tires for an off-road or dirt animation, a vehicle driving in the dirt animation, or sand or dust or whatever. So what have I got in this scene? I've got a car, a Mitsubishi Lancer from the transportation add-on. If you haven't used the transportation add-on, I'll talk more about that in another video, but just real quickly, I highly recommend you check it out. It is one of the most valuable, worthwhile add-ons you could ever purchase for Blender if you're considering doing a lot of vehicle animations. So this Mitsubishi Lancer is set up on the scene. There's a ground plane. It's got some little bumps in it, and there's a path set up for the car to be animated along. And if we press play, you can see the car drives down the path. The camera is set to follow an empty that's animated along with the car. And that's it. It's very basic, nothing fancy here. In a separate tutorial, we can go over how to use rig a car, how to use transportation, how to set up cool vehicle animations, how to bake the rotation of the wheels. All that is a story for another time. But in this case, this is just the groundwork for a basic scene. You can see down here what's happening through the camera, and this is the whole scene here. This is all that's happening. So what do we want to do? We want to make it look like some dust is actually flying off these tires as the car drives. First thing we need to do is make a domain for the dust. Now, you might have heard to make the domain as small as possible, which is true. You definitely want the domain to be as small as possible. But you might be misled into thinking that you have to make the domain just as big as the car and then parent the domain to the car and have the domain move along with the car. That will make the smoke sim kind of glitchy. So, contrary to what might seem like the best idea, you really want to make the domain as big as this whole scene that your vehicle is going to drive in. We're going to be using an adaptive domain that's going to make the actual domain that the smoke sim is taking place in only as big as it needs to be during the course of the animation. So we don't need to worry about that too much. So what we'll do is we'll add in a cube, and then we're going to make this cube as big or slightly bigger than this whole scene. So we're going to stretch it on the Y, and then let's move it so that its origin is right in the center of this ground plane here. Stretch it on the Y, stretch it on the X. Let's take a look at how tall it is. Can make it a little taller. The smoke's going to be rising up, so we want it to be a little bigger. And then from side view, let's bring it up so that the bottom of this smoke domain is just under the bottom of the ground plane. And then when the smoke interacts with the bottom of the domain, it'll give the illusion that it's actually interacting with the ground. Now we want to go over to the physics panel, and we want to make this a fluid domain. We set that to domain, and now it's got, I don't know what's going on right here, what that smoke is. So we're going to constantly need to adjust the settings of this domain. So what would be really helpful is if we make a new window over here. We set it to the properties. Click on that physics tab, and then pin this. Now we will always have our smoke domain settings here no matter what else we click on. That'll be very helpful because we'll need to do a lot of little back and forth between our smoke emitting objects and the smoke domain. You don't want to have to constantly click and open these panels again. So we've always got our smoke domain right here. Now we need some smoke emitters, right? The emitters are going to be inside the tires. We want invisible smoke emitters inside the tires that are actually going to emit the smoke, or in this case the dust. So I'm going to snap the cursor to the origin of this tire, and then in that tire I'm going to make a cylinder. We don't want anything on the cap. We'll make it 64 vertices. Then let's rotate it on the Y 90 degrees. Then let's shrink it down. And you know what? While we're working on this, let's just turn the visibility of this domain off. It'll make everything we're doing in the viewport much smoother and faster. That's weird, the visibility of the domain came back on. I think when we're done setting this cylinder up, we'll do that again. So something like that should be good to start. We can see the vertices of our cylinder inside the tire, what's going to become our smoke emitter. Let's turn that off. Now we want to duplicate that and put it on the other side. So we're going to, in edit mode, press Shift D, slide it on the x-axis right over to this tire. Okay, those are going to be our front emitters for the front tires. So we'll rename these front dust emitters. And now we want them for the rear too. So we're going to actually, let's not duplicate them yet. Let's set them up as smoke emitters first, then we'll duplicate them. It'll just be less work later, less repeat work. Alright, so those are in there. We're going to, in the physics tab for those, set them to fluid, flow objects. We want them to be smoke inflow. They're going to add fluid into the simulation. Right now, if we turn the visibility of this domain back on, okay, changing the resolution divisions will reset the smoke sim. That's because we're using the replay type of smoke cache right now. Anytime we make any changes to these settings in the domain, it's going to recalculate what we're doing here in the smoke domain. Obviously, this looks terrible right now. That's okay. We don't have to worry about that. Let's turn the visibility off, and let's go over what the settings need to be. You might have done some trial and error on your own and gotten somewhere around this point, but you might have gotten stuck in the process of iterating on the smoke sim. It can be exhausting because you make little changes to all these different settings and then you have to wait for it to recalculate. If you're using the bake type, you have to bake the whole thing depending on how high the resolution divisions are. The baking process can take a long time, so this whole process of creating a decent smoke sim is a lot of changing one or two things, rebaking, walking away, coming back, trying to play it, do an animation, understand what the glitches are. It can be very time consuming. The settings that I'm about to show you should give you a good foundation. They're not necessarily going to work for every type of smoke or dust simulation. They're not necessarily going to be exactly what each person is looking for in their particular animation, but hopefully it will cut out a lot of the trial and error and get you closer to something that you like in your animation and something that you can tweak a little bit and build on. Alright, so first thing we'll do to get a better idea of how this would look is to turn this up a little bit higher. Go to 64. And now if we were to press play, that's not what we want. They need to go along with the tires. So let's turn that visibility off. We need to parent these cylinders to the tires. So with the cylinders selected, we will shift click on the tires, press Control P, and then parent those to the object, keeping the transform. Now when we press play, if we click on these dust emitters and then we watch, they will rotate along with the tires. Alright, so that's a step in the right direction. Let's turn this visibility on. Let's change this so that it recalculates the smoke sim. We'll go up to 128. Now let's press play. And you can see we've got some very ugly smoke going along there. But that's okay, we're getting closer. If we look at the cube in the corner, this cube represents the size of the voxels that create the smoke for the simulation. This is very large. If you've done a little smoke sim in the past for a small scene, you'll know that as soon as you start to get into these higher numbers, it would be very slow. Your computer would start to slow down. Bake time would be forever. Because this domain is so large, the voxel size is larger as well. And when we do these resolution divisions, higher numbers, it's not as taxing on the system as you might think because it represents a large voxel size. So 256, when we play it back, it's starting to slow things down a little bit. This is a pretty janky animation, but is getting closer to where we want it to be. Now, we've got to make some changes to some things for this to actually start to look better. And then we'll duplicate these to the rear wheels and then start to have something that looks good coming from the front wheels and the rear wheels. So these are the settings that I'd recommend to start with. First of all, we want an adaptive domain. Okay, we've got the adaptive domain on. That is already going to make a huge difference in how fast this animation will run or how fast the system will be able to play it back in the viewport for us. You can already see that helps a lot, not having a super large domain. Now, we want the smoke to dissolve. We don't want it just hanging around forever. So we're going to click the dissolve checkbox, and then we're going to set the time we want it to dissolve. This dust should fly up in the air and hang out for a little bit before it dissolves. So setting it to something like 20 or 15 is a decent start. You can play it back with it set at 15. But again, anytime you make any changes in here, you won't really see them reflected until you make a change up here and then play it back. When the cache is set to replay, the only way to get it to recalculate is to change the resolution divisions. As far as I know, I'm not sure if that's changed in 3.0 or what, but usually you have to change this value to get it to recalculate and accept other changes that you've made. So we've got it dissolving now. If we take a look, we should see that smoke generate and then start to dissolve. And then you can see it disappearing there. That's good. Okay, next thing is we do want to add some noise. And this is going to make the simulation more intense to calculate, but we do want some noise in the smoke. Now, as far as the settings for the noise, an up-res factor of 3 should be good We can leave these other settings alone. Change these resolution divisions again. I usually just toggle back and forth by a factor of 2. Smoke sims seem to work best if you use factors of 2. It started out at 32. You can go to 64, 128, 256, and so on. If you just do like a random number, sometimes it makes things a little glitchy, so you might want to keep that in mind. Now if we play this back, we can see that there's going to be some noise in the simulation. It's hard to see in this view, but it's adding a little bit of randomness to the smoke in the form of noise. Response to clicking buttons will be a little slower when it's playing and calculating smoke sim at the same time. So if you click play and then you try to click pause, it might not respond right away, depending on your machine, your PC specs. Alright, so we also want this dust to not really act like smoke. We don't want it to have heat values and buoyancy. So we're going to set the buoyancy to 0 and the heat to 0. And then vorticity, it's the amount of turbulence and rotation in the smoke. So each voxel of smoke is going to move around and rotate and do things a little more naturally. This value is very sensitive. If you turn this vorticity up very high, the smoke will just go bananas. So for vorticity, a value of 0.1 is a pretty good place to start. You can tweak that later. Now if we go up here and let's go up to 512, play it. It's obviously the playback's going to be pretty slow, but you can see we're starting to get something that looks a little better. It's not this giant cloud enveloping the whole car, and it's going to be doing some more activity and some more natural movement. It's definitely not where we want it to be yet, though. Okay, so now we want to make the smoke emitters different than their default settings. That's going to also improve the look of things a lot. Now we want to take the sampling substeps, because this car is going to be moving fast, and when it starts to get up to speed around the middle of its animation, the smoke is going to have spaces between it where you're going to see there's obvious little gaps between each little puff of smoke coming out. You don't want that. For a fast-moving smoke flow, you need to set sampling substeps higher so it fills in the gaps in between. And anytime you're not sure what something does, just hover over it and it will explain it. I mean, it says right here basically what I was just saying. Additional samples to take between frames to improve the quality of fast-moving flows. If you're trying to just poke your way through Blender and figure stuff out for yourself, just hovering over stuff can give you sometimes some insight. Sometimes the explanation in there won't be very helpful, but oftentimes it'll give you a good idea of what a field does, and help you decide, should I mess with this factor or not. In this case, we're going to set this to 4, and then we're going to have absolute density. Initial temperature will be -1. And then for the flow source, we want it to flow from the mesh. Since it's not a closed mesh, those cylinders don't have caps on them. They're just kind of like a thin cylinder with no ends. We want to tell Blender that it is planar. And we don't want the smoke coming out this big from the tire. We want it to be kind of closer. So the surface emission value is going to be 0.5. That'll bring it down a little bit closer. Let's set this lower and we'll see what has changed. I'm like, okay, it's looking a little better. A little. And then we do want to set an initial velocity. We want it to pick up half of the value of its source. We've got the mesh itself rotating because it's parented to the tires, right? So we want to pick that up and add it to the way that the smoke is generated. We want it to move and rotate as it's generated, not like it's just coming out of a static object. And then we want it to kind of shoot backwards along the y-axis. So we're going to give it 2 meters per second of initial velocity on the y-axis. Now let's change this value. Let's play the sim, and you can see down here and here what we're getting. That is starting to look more like what we want, right? Now, it's when we raise this to the ultimate value that we want at the end, which is 1280, it's going to look much better. But we're not going to go all the way to 1280 until we're getting close to our final bake, because to set it to 1280 right now would be extremely slow playback in the viewport. We don't really want to do that to ourselves just yet. So the setup here for the front tires is pretty good. That's decent, right? Now let's move these to the rear tires. Let's take and duplicate these, put them in the rear. Just try and get them right in there in a spot that looks good. And now let's change the name here to rear dust emitters. And now all their settings are there. That's nice, we didn't have to reset all that. That was the benefit of just getting them set first and duplicating them. What we do want to do is go to the front ones and cut their density in half. That's going to make a little less smoke come from the front tires than the rear tires, which will actually look a little bit more realistic. I think even in a four-wheel drive vehicle, at least what will visually look cool in an animation would look like more dust is coming out of the rear tires than the front tires. Ultimately, you can set that however you want, though. Really, a lot of this is just my own personal preference from playing around with this. But really, feel free to improve upon this, change it, tweak it, do whatever you see fit for the stylized look of your animation. Or if you do some research on videos of real cars driving through the dust and you want to go for something that looks really realistic, tweak these settings to give you more of that look. Again, this is just a foundation for you to build upon, and I hope it does help you. Alright, so then let's go back to 256, and then let's see what happens here. Now you can see we've got smoke coming from the rear, but what exactly is going on? This is not what we want. What is this? That is because the rear cylinders for these rear dust emitters are parented still to the front tires. So they are flying around in a real goofy way here. That's not what we want, right? So let's go. Okay, so we're going to clear the parenting on these rear cylinders. Keep the transformation. Shift click the tires. Parent them to the rear tires. Now let's change this, and then let's replay the animation. And now we get less dust coming from the front tires, more dust coming from the rear tires. That's starting to look not too bad, right? Now the dust itself isn't going to actually render. If we render a frame right now, let's go ahead and do a quick render. I'm going to just press F12 and see what we get. Okay, in my render, I don't see any smoke at all, but I see it in the viewport. What exactly is going on here? The problem is that the material for the smoke domain does not exist yet. So let's click this cube. This is our smoke domain. Let's actually rename that so we know what that is. And then let's go to our shading tab. And you can see it has no material. We're going to press new. and then we need to change the principled BSDF to a principled volume shader. And now if we go into cycles right here, you can see we don't see anything, right? As soon as we plug this volume into the volume socket, we'll see something here. Okay, so we've got something, right? This thin gray smoke. That's not what we want. We want it to look like it's the color of whatever the ground is in your scene. So we're going to put in a color ramp. And we're going to make that the colors of the ground. Now the density, you don't have to worry about changing the density of the flow objects in the smoke sim. You can really have a big impact on the density of the smoke just right here in the shader editor. Crank this density up to something like 10, and now you're getting a much different look to this smoke, right? Now we can see it better, and we can tweak the colors here. I'm trying to look through the pixelation as I set these values until we get the effect that we're looking for on the smoke here. Okay, so that looks pretty decent. That kind of looks like this dust might be coming from this ground. It's darker, it's getting kicked up, it's got some shadowing in it, the way the light and shadow are working inside the dust, but it looks like it could be coming from here. That's what you're trying to go for. Try to match the color up so the dust really looks like it's from the ground that your vehicle's driving on. Now, let's go back to our layout view. And if we were to switch this over to cycles, we get a good idea of what we're looking at right here. We can work in the viewport here in regular solid view, and we can click this over to cycles once in a while, and since it's a nice small view, it'll render pretty quick and we'll see what we're looking at. Alright, so that is looking pretty decent, right? Now if we crank this up to our final 1280, and then we play this, this is going to be extremely slow in the viewport. Ultimately, we're going to bake this and just walk away, go do something for an hour or so and come back and take a look at it. The more smoke it generates as it gets further along the timeline, each frame is going to take increasingly long. So when we have a good idea of our settings all being right, we'll switch it from replay to all, and we'll just bake it right in. Then we can come back and play it and get a much better idea of what we're looking at. But I think you can see we're starting to get a better look here. Now, one thing that's missing right now that's going to affect dust in real life is the wind. And if a car is driving outside, there's going to be some wind. There might be a gentle breeze. It might be very windy, depending on your scene. You want to take that into account. If you've already got a physics force of wind in the scene, it'll naturally have an effect on the smoke. If you have things animated in the scene to look like it's windy, then you'll want to add a physics force of wind to affect this smoke in a way that's similar to the other objects in your scene. Having some wind blow this smoke away as it's created will really add to the realism of the scene. You can also add a physics force of turbulence behind the vehicle and then animate that force with keyframes to move along behind the vehicle, and you can get some turbulence behind the car, and that'll stir that smoke up as it's generated. So let's add, in our case here, let's just add some wind. We'll go add force field wind. We'll move this on the x-axis, slide it down on the y. Let's turn that off for now. And then we want to rotate this on the y. Rotate this on the y minus 90 degrees. And then we want to look at this wind force, and we want to make it much larger. We want it to affect this whole scene. We want big wind blowing over here. We don't want it to be super strong. You'll see, let's just set this back down. If it's really strong wind, it's going to blow that smoke away too fast. We'll look at this from up above. And you see what's happening here? It's blowing that smoke away probably a little too fast. We want it to kind of dissipate, but we don't want it to just kind of disperse the smoke. Unless that's what you want. Maybe you want this kind of look. You know, that's ultimately what it's all about, is just whatever you want it to look like. I'm going to take the strength of this wind down by about 0.5. And then we are going to add some noise. We don't want a constant wind. Sometimes the wind will blow in little gusts and breezes, right? It's not like we will have a giant fan on the scene. So we'll add some noise. Now we'll go back to the beginning of the timeline, change this setting, replay, and see what we get. Okay, so that amount of wind is doing a pretty decent job at making that smoke move and disperse. If we were to render this, you get a little idea of what we're looking at there. The voxel size of the smoke is really big right now. It's on 256, so this is like giant, all-encompassing smoke, which is not exactly what we're going for. You just have to remember that it is going to look better than this when you set this to 1280 and then you bake it out and then you come back and take a look at it. Okay, let's actually do that. Let's set it to 1280. We're not going to bake the whole thing out right now, but we'll let it play. We'll get it 10 or 15 frames in and then see what this looks like. Okay, so you can see how it's taking a long time to calculate as it's creating the smoke. But let's do a quick render and see what it's looking like now. Okay, so hopefully you can see that you're getting somewhere, that this is starting to look more like how you want it to look. If you feel like you don't want this much dust in the front of the vehicle, go over to the front dust emitters and then reduce this density even further, 0.25 let's say. Set the timeline back to the beginning, change the resolution divisions, play it back, see how much it's changing or improving. Now, even on a lower setting like 512, you can see you're getting closer to having this look like the majority of the dust is coming from the rear and not from the front. Set it up to 1280. Replay it. At this high of a resolution division, it's going to be pretty slow naturally. It's calculating the smoke as it's playing. So you might think, oh, I'll just skip ahead in the timeline to a frame up here somewhere. But theoretically, these frames have not happened yet as far as the physics calculations in the simulation are concerned. These frames have not occurred yet. It's creating them while it's playing. So you can't just skip ahead. You have to let it play from the beginning so it can create the smoke simulation while it's playing. If we were to bake it and walk away, you could come back and pick any frame you want, but you're going to be walking away for quite a while to let the whole thing bake. So you just be patient. Keep your Nintendo Switch near you, or your phone near you, or a book near you or something, so that you can do something for a minute or so while it's doing its process here, and then you can pause it. It's going to be pretty slow to respond to mouse inputs when it's trying to figure out the smoke sim. Do a render. Now you can get a good idea of what you're looking at. And this might look a little better. Less smoke coming from the front, more smoke coming from the rear. We have the wind blowing the dust towards the side of the car that we have the camera on, so more of the car is concealed by this dust cloud because this is the side the wind's blowing it on. If we had the camera on the other side, we'd see more of the car and the dust being blown away. Hopefully in your animation you have some fancy camera work going on and you're capturing this thing from many different angles, so you will see the rear tire spinning at some point in your animation because you're not always going to be blowing the dust this way. You can play around with different physics forces like turbulence that drags behind the car, or wind that's moving, a smaller wind force that's moving in different spots. However you want to do it, just this is not the only way to do smoke. Play around with these settings. The thing is, when you play with the settings for a smoke sim, I would advise you to only change one thing at a time. Smoke sims can be pretty fickle, and if you change more than one setting in the domain and in the flow objects, it could have a really wacky impact on how it looks. You might walk away, let the whole thing bake, come back after dinner or something and look, and it might look awful. You might hate it. And then you might say, geez, I gotta go back to all my previous settings and I'm not sure what they were. I'm not sure exactly what I changed. And then it can get very frustrating of a process of trial and error that has derailed and you're not even sure how to get back to where you were. And you might say, I really liked it before, I should have left it alone. I changed too much stuff and now I'm lost. So change one thing at a time, see how you like it, tweak another one or two things, see how you like it. But try not to lose track of where you were. Make sure you can revert back and be patient. If you make changes beyond what we've shown here, you're going to have to be very patient in letting the whole thing calculate and come back. Hopefully, though, this gives you a good starting point. Another thing to note is you can animate all of these. You see that there's an animation button next to all of these factors. So in the beginning of your simulation, if you want the smoke to start small, you can start these at 0, add an animation keyframe, get a certain amount of frames into your animation, and have these values slowly rise up to the sweet spot so that as the vehicle's velocity increases, so does the amount of dust being emitted, or the velocity of the dust being emitted, the amount of dust coming out, or the buoyancy of the dust, whatever you want. You can change all these factors and animate them throughout the course of the animation. You might want to play around with that and have things ramp up and then die down. When the car comes to a stop, you don't want smoke to just keep pouring out of these tires as the car comes to a stop. So if you have your vehicle coming to a stop, you'll want to set a keyframe at the end to get these values down to 0 as far as the smoke emission and velocity, so that at the end of the animation they all come to a stop. And you could have that interpolation on that set to Bezier, so things slowly come to a stop and they don't just abruptly end. And that'll give you a nice look in the animation too. So that is about it. I don't think there's really much more I could tell you. Well, actually, I guess the last thing would be to go ahead and bake this out. So if you reset your frame to 1, and then you switch the cache type on this smoke from replay to all, and then you click bake all, now it's going to go through and do this fluid bake down here. It's going to seem like it's going quickly at first. You might say, oh, this isn't going to take too long. But again, as you get further along in the smoke sim, it's going to get more complex. The wind is going to be affecting more of it. There'll be more smoke generated. It will start to take longer. So you might walk away for 5 or 10 minutes and come back and be surprised that it's not as far along as you thought it was going to be. Again, that depends on the specs of your PC. You might have a very powerful PC and this process might not take that long, so that'll be nice if that's the case. If it does take a while, hopefully you've got something to keep busy. go take a shower, drop a deuce, play a video game, read a book, something, and then come back, and when this thing is done, it'll be a little bit faster to play it along the timeline. It'll be easier to pick specific points along the timeline, and you could also do a low resolution render of all 250 frames or however long your animation is, and then make a video of it, play that video back, and get a good feel for how it's looking. If you're doing a low res render, like 50% or 25% of 1080, and you do low samples, like 8 samples, and you just render it all out so the render time is like 10 or 20 seconds per frame, that'll give you the ability to render out the whole animation and then watch a low quality version of it and see if there's any weird flickers in the smoke or glitches in the movement of the smoke cloud, or anything funky going on. Worst case scenario would be you render out a really high quality version, a high sample count, full 1080p resolution. The thing takes hours and hours to render, all night. You go to bed, you come back, you play it back, and you don't like something you see in there, and that feels like wasted time. So I'd recommend keeping the render time per frame low by keeping the samples low and the resolution low, so you can just get a quick look if there's any issues to fix before you spend all the time and anticipation rendering out the high quality, high resolution version of it. But that's it. So make any changes you want, bake your simulation out, and then you've got something locked in that you can come back and start to finish up other stuff in your scene. You can always turn the visibility of the smoke sim off so your viewport won't get slowed down by it, and then you can add props to your scene or tweak whatever other stuff you want. There is a way to make dust accumulate on the vehicle itself. If you've seen the truck animation on my channel, you'll probably notice at the end of the animation the body parts of the truck and the tires have dust accumulated on them by the end of the animation. There is a way that you can do that. I think that's a topic for another time, but it would be all that other stuff you'd want to do now that your smoke sim is dialed in and baked and ready to go. So that's it. And then with that being said, I suppose that wraps this part up. So come back after your bake is done and have a great time. Hopefully that gets you going. If you have questions, ask them in the comment section. If you found ways to improve on this process, please share it in the comment section. If you have a YouTube channel where you've done a smoke sim better than this, or discovered a couple different factors that we haven't talked about that work better, feel free to do a little self-promotion. There's nothing wrong with that. Put the link in the comment section. Tell people to come check out your channel. Ultimately, in the community, if we all share our information, we'll all be better off. So I hope that this served as a little starting point and a foundation to help you avoid a bunch of the trial and error that I went through to get to this point. And then if you can build on and improve on this, that is terrific. Please share that information so that we can all benefit from that as well. I hope that this did help you. I hope that if you came here and you found this tutorial, maybe you were previously really stumped by this, and this got you to a better place where you've got a smoke sim going in your vehicle animation that you're happy with now, and that has saved you a lot of time and hassle. So that's it. Thanks very much for watching. Don't ever give up on your Blender journey. Know that you'll find the answers out there somewhere, and if you haven't already, consider starting your own YouTube channel, because I bet that you have something to contribute to the Blender community. And don't doubt yourself. Don't think that you're not good enough. Don't think that you don't really have anything to offer. We all have unique perspectives. We all have little techniques that we've developed and little tricks, and we can all help each other. So if you haven't already done it, consider starting a YouTube channel, putting your stuff out there. I guarantee you people will appreciate your stuff, and your stuff will help somebody out there, and you'll become somebody contributing to the community instead of somebody who doubts themselves and doesn't think they have anything to offer to the community. So keep up the great work, keep blendering, keep making your dreams become a 3D reality, and thanks very much for stopping by, and have a great day.